It was a night without shape. The clouds hung low and heavy, swallowing the moonlight, leaving the sky a bottomless pit. From the cockpit of the Halifax bomber, Lieutenant James Hopkins could see nothing. No horizon, no stars, not even the faint glow of the instruments beneath the frost gathering on the glass. Only darkness. Altitude steady at 10,000, the navigator muttered, his voice a low vibration in the black void. Hopkins gripped the control yoke harder. The bomber trembled in the wind, a slow metallic groan that seemed to come from inside his bones. Somewhere far below, Germany was supposed to be burning. Factories, refineries, targets marked in red pencil on maps they could no longer read. But all he saw was black. All he heard was the engine's endless drone. "Where are we?" someone asked over the intercom. The navigator hesitated. "I think. Somewhere near Bremen." "You think?" A pause. "Could be Hanover." Hopkins laughed once, bitterly. "We're not bombing. We're guessing." The bombs were armed, but no one wanted to drop them. Not like this. They were flying blind through a wall of cloud that stretched from horizon to horizon, their compasses twitching, their radar screens blank. They had been trained to read the stars, but tonight the stars were gone. Another voice crackled over the wireless, distorted by static. "Base to Lima 27, report target confirmation." Hopkins lifted the transmitter. "Negative visual." "Repeat, negative visual." "Then estimate," came the cold reply. "Command wants the payload released." He hesitated. His finger hovered over the release switch. Estimate. That word had come to mean death for people he would never see. When he finally pressed the button, the bomber lurched, lighter now, freer. But the emptiness below swallowed the sound of the falling bombs. No light, no fire, just the same suffocating blackness. Minutes later, another voice came through, a different crew, panicked. "We hit something. God, it wasn't a plant, it was a town." The intercom went silent. Nobody spoke. When they landed back in England hours later, the dawn was gray and cruel. The ground crews said nothing as they counted the missing aircraft. The officers smoked in silence, faces pale with exhaustion. Someone finally muttered, "We're killing ghosts." In the debriefing room, Hopkins sat with his logbook open but blank. He had nothing to write. In London, the reports arrived within days. Half the bombs had missed their targets entirely. Some had fallen on open fields. Some on small villages whose names no one in the Royal Air Force could even pronounce. The public knew nothing, but the generals did. And behind the closed doors of the Air Ministry, the word failure hung in the air like smoke. The debate was bitter. Some officers blamed the weather. Others blamed the pilots. One colonel slammed his fist on the table. "We're sending men into the sky to die for coordinates they can't even see." But amid the shouting, one voice remained calm. A thin man in a crumpled tweed jacket, sitting at the back of the room, spoke quietly. "Gentlemen," he said, "if we cannot see the Earth, then perhaps we can teach the aircraft to hear it." His name was Albert Taylor, an engineer on loan from the BBC Research Department, known for building odd machines that hummed and sparked and sometimes exploded. The officers turned toward him, unimpressed. "Hear the Earth?" one of them scoffed. "This isn't folklore, Taylor. We need results, not poetry." Taylor adjusted his glasses. "Radio waves," he said simply. "They can bounce off the ground. If we learn to interpret the reflection, the plane could know where it is, even in darkness." The colonel snorted. "You want to use a wireless set to replace a pilot's eyes?" "I want," Taylor replied, "to give a blind man his sight back." For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone laughed, the kind of short, tired laugh men use when they've run out of hope. The idea sounded absurd, childish even. But something in Taylor's voice carried a conviction none of them could ignore. That night, while the rain lashed against the laboratory windows in Malvern, he began sketching. Circuits, antennae, cathode screens glowing like green ghosts. He worked alone, cigarette smoke curling around the faint hum of an oscillator. Outside, the wind tore across the airfield. Somewhere in the distance, another bomber roared into the sky, bound for another blind mission. Taylor looked up from his desk, listening to the engines fade into the dark. He whispered to himself, "We'll find a way to see you home." No one believed him yet. Not the generals, not the scientists, not even his own assistants. But in a damp basement under an old building near Cambridge, the first pieces of a machine were already taking shape. It would hum and flicker and spit blue sparks. It would burn through cables and fuse circuits. It would drive men half mad with exhaustion. And one day soon, it would do what no human eye could: pierce the darkness and see the earth beneath the clouds. No one in that room knew it yet, but war had just changed forever. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The basement was always cold. Even in summer, the concrete walls bled moisture, and the lamps buzzed like trapped bees. Coils of wire hung from nails, shadowed by the green glow of a single cathode ray tube. Over it leaned Albert Taylor, the BBC engineer who had once said, "If we can't see the ground, we'll teach the aircraft to hear it." He hadn't slept properly in weeks. Neither had Bernard Lovell, the quiet physicist beside him, who could calculate phase angles faster than he could light a cigarette. Together, they were trying to make the impossible work, a machine that could see through darkness. The project had a name now: H2S. No one knew what it meant. Some called it Home Sweet Home. Others joked it was the smell of rotten eggs from the gas used to test the circuits. Taylor only said, "It's a map that draws itself." Their world was one of burnt fingertips, cigarette ash, and static crackle. They built, tested, failed, rebuilt, again and again. The room was full of half-broken components and the quiet desperation of men fighting not just an enemy, but time. Every night they worked as bombers droned overhead, heading east into the dark. Every morning, some of those bombers didn't return. When the Air Ministry inspectors visited, their polished boots left wet marks on the floor. One of them, a wing commander, stared at the radar set like it was a child's toy. "You want us to bolt this onto a Halifax?" he asked. "It weighs as much as 2 Browning guns." Taylor didn't look up. "Would you rather fly blind?" "Pilots have done it for 3 years," the officer said flatly. "And how many have come back?" Taylor's voice was quiet, but it cut through the hum of equipment. No one answered. The first field test looked more like a bad joke than science. They mounted the radar on the back of a lorry, ran cables through the windows, and drove it across muddy roads near Malvern. The signal danced and flickered: hills, trees, a farmhouse glowing brighter than anything else. Lovell scribbled in his notebook: "Stone walls loud, fields quiet, river loud if broad." When the lorry hit a cattle grid, the set flickered and went dead. Taylor smacked it once. It came back to life. He grinned through the exhaustion. "See? Even machines don't like the countryside." A few nights later came the moment that changed everything. They moved the set to a small hut near the airfield, aimed the antenna toward London, and switched on the power. For a few seconds, nothing. Just noise, static, and green haze. Then, slowly, a soft curve appeared across the screen. A faint, shimmering line that bent like an S. Taylor froze. "That's the river." Lovell stepped closer. "The Thames." The officers watching didn't move. The wing commander, the same skeptic from before, leaned forward. "If that's true," he whispered. Then London just answered back. It was the first radar image of a city in history, and it had been drawn in light and echoes. Word spread quickly, though half the higher-ups didn't believe it. "Mirages," one general said. "Artifacts." Another circled the report's weight estimate in red ink and growled. 2 guns worth of metal for a fancy radio? You'll get no bombers from me." But others understood. They'd seen what night raids had become, guessing games with thousands of lives at stake. "If this machine can give them eyes," one officer said, "it's worth its weight in gold." So the order came: fit H2S into a Halifax and test it in flight. The morning of the test, the hangar was silent. Mechanics circled the bomber as if it were alive. Taylor climbed into the narrow nose compartment, hands shaking from more caffeine than sleep. He ran one last check. Magnetron stable, cooling steady, display clear. "Ready?" the pilot asked. "As we'll ever be," Taylor said. Engines roared. The Halifax rolled down the runway and lifted into gray sky. Inside, the screen glowed softly, trembling with every vibration. At first, the trace was chaotic, static, noise, storm clutter. Then, as they crossed the coast, the sea appeared, smooth, dark, silent. A few minutes later, a pale shape bloomed on the edge of the screen, the shoreline. It worked. Taylor stared, hardly breathing. "It's drawing the world," he whispered. When they landed, he didn't celebrate. He just stood on the tarmac, rain soaking his coat. watching the bomber's engines cool. "We've changed the dark," he said quietly. But even as the team celebrated in the hangar, Lovell noticed something strange. Faint signals echoing back from nowhere, as if someone else was already listening to their invention. For now, no one paid attention. The tests had succeeded. H-2S would fly in combat. What they didn't know, what no one yet could know, was that their miracle would soon betray them. January 19th, 1943 began with frost on the runway and a wind that gnawed at faces. The Halifax prototype, tail number V9977, sat nose to the breeze, its new black chin of H-2S looking like an extra jaw. Ground crew stamped their feet, breath turning to steam. Inside the cramped nose, a young technician tapped the cathode tube with a fingernail and got that soft green bloom he trusted more than sleep. Albert Taylor climbed down the ladder, checked a cable with numb fingers, and told the pilot, "If she hums, she sees." They were only meant to circle whales and come home. Off the coast, the set would paint sea as darkness, land as pale, rivers would be silver nerves. In the bomb bay, there were no bombs. Only batteries and a lash-up of transformers that made the fuselage smell like hot dust. 11 men aboard. Aircrew plus the boffins who had built the miracle. Someone joked about bringing a violin to play when London appeared on the screen. Nobody laughed. V9977 lifted into a sky the color of tin. On the ground, Lovell shaded the tube in a truck-borne receiver, catching a faint, obedient trace relayed down from the aircraft. Coastline thickening. Estuary brightening, the instrument's steady heartbeat. Taylor watched the bomber climb, a black diagonal against cloud, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. The call came 12 minutes later. Not a voice, just a flurry of syllables cut clean by static, then an edge of panic. A witness on a hill saw the wing dip, then a sudden white flash inside the fuselage, too bright to be engine flame. The Halifax turned into fire and falling metal in one motion. A flower that opened and rained itself down. The sound reached the airfield late, a flat punch that drove heads down by instinct. They found the wreckage scattered over peat and gorse, the smell of aviation fuel mixing with burned rubber and damp earth. The nose was unrecognizable. The H-2S radome lay cracked like an eggshell 30 yards from a crater that steamed in the cold air. The bodies were carried out on canvas tarps, the lists made in pencil that smudged under shaking hands. 11 dead, the lead engineer among them, the man who had coaxed the first river out of noise. A ground crewman knelt in the heather and pressed his palms together without words. By evening, the lab was a room of open coats and shut mouths. An official from the ministry arrived with the terrible tidiness of bureaucracy. He read from a sheet, "Project suspended pending review." Another line, "Unacceptable risk to crews." The order felt like a lid placed on a living thing. Taylor walked out before the meeting finished. He went back to the field with a torch and a sack. The wind had dropped. The crash site ticked as metal cooled. He crouched where the nose must have struck and lifted a charred fragment of the antenna ring. It left black on his gloves. He turned the piece over as if it might whisper an apology. In the torchlight, the jag of broken waveguide looked like a jaw. He said, to nobody, "You were working." Then he put the fragment in the sack and carried it home. For 3 days, the corridors around Malvern sounded like a church after a funeral. Doors closed quietly. Cups of tea went untouched. A letter of condolence was dictated, typed, retyped. Then, on the 4th morning, Taylor placed the scorched antenna on the bench like a relic and said, "We continue." Someone objected. He answered in a voice scraped thin. "They died to lift a blindfold. We will not tie it back." They reworked the power feeds, rerouted cooling air, replaced valves with sturdier glass. Lovell recalculated a dozen tolerances and tore 3 pages out of his notebook when the numbers refused to sit still. The riggers in the hangar learned new gentleness. No hard knocks near the chin, no loose bolts where vibration would breed. Each checklist line got a second tick with a different pencil. Every cable lashing got a second knot. Grief turned into torque values and safety wire. The next flight waited for a clear gap in February weather. A pale noon torn open by wind. The replacement Halifax roared, lighter than a bomber had any right to be when it wanted to live. In the nose, the tube warmed. The trace fluttered, then steadied into the low purr of electrons finding work. Rolling. the pilot said, and the runway blurred backwards until the wheels left it behind. They crossed the Bristol Channel at 6,000 feet. Sea on the scope, dark, obedient. Then Wales eased into view as a soft, mottled brightness, valleys tracing themselves like fingerprints. A river brightened and slid beneath them. A coastal town pricked into a cluster of hot grains. The bomb aimer, who had spent a year guessing at black squares under black cloud, put a gloved finger on the glass and whispered, "There." He didn't mean a target. He meant a place. Back on the ground, men leaned into the headphones and grinned without showing teeth. The aircraft called, "Image stable. Shoreline confirmed. Request heading to Test City return." The controller cleared them to Swansea. Over the docks the display burned richer, louder. The pilot banked, and the city swung on the tube like a lantern held from a moving hand. "Good God," someone said. "It's drawing." When the wheels kissed tarmac again, the hangar erupted in a sound nobody had expected. Not cheers, exactly, but the collective exhale of people who had been holding their breath for weeks. A wrench clanged as it fell. Someone laughed once, ragged and surprised. Taylor stepped down from the nose compartment, touched the cold skin of the radome, and closed his eyes. "Second berth," he said. "We don't waste it." The ministry reversed itself with the smoothness of authority. H2S would go to squadrons on Lancasters first, then Halifax's, issued with instructions typed in a font that made bravery look like procedure. Crews came to Malvern in 2s and 3s to put faces to the box that would live in their aircraft. The veterans said little, but their hands hovered over the tube with the care they reserved for maps and photographs. In the flush of relief, only Lovell kept hearing the oddities hiding in the returns, faint teeth in the noise, small rhythms that did not belong to weather or coast. He made a note. Possible external illumination? Then he shut the notebook because the squadron lorry was waiting outside to take the set north. There would be time later to worry about what echoes meant when they came from somewhere you did not control. That night, as the first operational aircraft rolled toward blacked-out runways with a new chin and a new way of knowing, the sky above England felt different. The dark was still there, but it had edges now, features, names. Men climbed into their aircraft with the first small, guilty hope that they might choose their targets instead of guessing them. Nobody in the briefing rooms said the other truth aloud. Anything that speaks can be overheard. H2S was a beacon as well as a lantern, and far across the water, ears had already begun to turn toward its song. February 1943. Snow drifted over the runway, soft as ash. The Lancasters waited in line, their noses heavy with something new, the black radome of H2S. Mechanics moved like ghosts in the cold. Inside one bomber, the navigator checked his watch. The bomb aimer traced a finger across the strange round screen in front of him. "If this works," he whispered, "we'll see the Ruhr tonight." Engines roared. The aircraft lifted into the dark, swallowed by cloud. At 12,000 feet, the world ended. No moon, no horizon, only static and breath. "Course 270, came the calm voice over intercom. "Level." The bomb aimer switched on the radar. At first, nothing. Then a gray smear began to form, faint, uncertain, gathering shape until a pale ribbon appeared across the glass. "Oh God," he whispered. "That's the river." The Thames had looked like that in testing, and now, over Germany, the same pattern rose from darkness. The pilot leaned closer. The black void of Europe began to glow with scattered brightness. Towns, railways, rivers. "It's real," the navigator breathed. "We've got the Ruhr." Below, the night burned silently. German searchlights stabbed upward, but the bombers stayed hidden in the clouds. Flak thumped, blind and furious. On the H2S screen, the Ruhr Valley spread out like a living map. The factory blocks shone brighter than anything else, hard white spots against the gray. The bomb aimer adjusted the knobs, focused the image. "That's Essen," he said. "We're right over it." The target was supposed to be the Krupp Works, the industrial heart of Germany. For years, crews had guessed, trusting luck and stars. Tonight, they saw. The bomb aimer's voice dropped. "Steady, steady, bombs gone." The Lancaster lifted, suddenly lighter. A second later, the screen flickered, the factory blooming into a flare of interference, too bright to read. The pilot's throat tightened. "Good hit," someone said softly. Nobody cheered. From the ground, A German air raid warden stared up into blackness. He'd seen raids drift before, wild, scattered. But this one came straight, precise. They don't miss anymore, he muttered. Bombs walked down the rail lines like handwriting. In the distance, steelworks roared, and the sky pulsed red behind the snow. On the return leg, silence filled the intercom. The bomb aimer watched the green screen fade into static. He ran his thumb over the glass, whispering, "We can see now." The tail gunner answered after a long pause. "Aye, and maybe they can see us too." In High Wycombe, the staff officers stared at reports from the night's mission. Coordinates matched perfectly with target maps. One colonel set his pen down and said, almost to himself, "We can win with instruments." The next morning, newspapers said nothing. No mention of radar, no photographs. But in the headquarters of Bomber Command, the mood was different, a quiet confidence, like the air before thunder. Crews called the new device the eye in the dark. Taylor, back in Malvern, read the coded telegram. H2S effective. Accuracy unprecedented. He didn't smile. Instead, he stared at the oscilloscope in front of him, listening to the hum. "It sees too well," he murmured. Lovell glanced up. "What do you mean?" Taylor hesitated. "Anything that can find others," he said slowly, "can be found itself." That night, over the smoldering valleys of the Ruhr, the bombers droned home under stars they couldn't see. The crews felt something new, power, awe, and an unease none of them could name. They had changed the dark. But across the channel, in a different bunker, a German radar operator bent over his own glowing screen. A strange pulse flickered there, faint but steady, a heartbeat in the static. He frowned, adjusting his dials. "Commandant," he called. "Something's talking out there." And for the first time, Germany began to listen. Spring 1943. A Lancaster bomber was shot down near Rotterdam. Locals saw it burning low, one wing shearing off before it vanished into the marshes. By dawn, German engineers were already there, boots sinking in wet soil. Among the wreckage, they found something odd, a black dome, cracked but intact, and inside it a tangle of wires, valves, and glass tubes that pulsed faintly even in death. Major Heinz Froelich, of the Luftwaffe's Radar Research Division, crouched beside it. He ran a hand over the metal, noting the smooth machining, the strange curvature. "This isn't a bomb sight," he murmured. "It's an eye." The soldiers looked at him, confused. "Take it apart carefully," he said. "Don't break its brain." Within days, the remains of the British radar were shipped under guard to the testing center at Travemünde, near Lübeck. The engineers there were astonished. The label on one circuit read H2S, confidential property of H.M. government. They had never seen anything like it. Vacuum tubes arranged in concentric layers, a waveguide bent like sculpture, precision tuning coils finer than a human hair. "This," one technician whispered, "is the future." They worked through the night, mapping every frequency, every pulse. On the oscilloscope, the British signal flickered in a slow, rhythmic pattern, a heartbeat of radio light. And then came the realization. If it emitted, it could be detected. By May, German scientists at the Telefunken labs had built a crude receiver tuned to that same wavelength. They called it Naxos. It didn't show cities or rivers. It didn't need to. It showed them, the bombers themselves, each one a tiny beacon in the sky. Unaware it was shouting its position into the night. At an airfield near Hanover, a night fighter squadron began testing the device. On a moonless night, a Bf-110 lifted off, its pilot guided only by the whisper of Naxos in his headphones. At first, just static, then a faint pulse. He banked toward it. Signal increasing, his radar operator reported. 10 minutes later, he saw black silhouettes against the faint clouds, for bombers, flying straight and blind. The fighter Dove, firing. The first Lancaster exploded before anyone aboard could even call out. In England, Bomber Command was confused. Losses spiked. Crews vanished without distress calls. "They're waiting for us," one surviving pilot said. "They know exactly where we are." Some blamed traitors, others bad luck. No one suspected that their greatest secret had become a homing beacon. At Malvern, Taylor noticed a pattern in the reports. The aircraft that went missing were all equipped with H2S. He read the telegrams twice, then again. His pencil hovered above the desk. "No," he whispered. "Not possible. But the evidence kept growing. His invention, the one meant to save crews from the dark, might be the thing killing them. He called a meeting that same night. Suppose, he began carefully, the enemy can hear our signal. Silence. Lovell frowned. They'd have to build a receiver tuned exactly to our wavelength. Taylor stared at the map on the wall, dotted with the last known positions of lost aircraft. Maybe they already have. For the first time, the lab felt cold. Around them, the equipment hummed like something guilty. The younger engineers looked at Taylor, the man who had given bombers sight, and saw in his face the expression of someone realizing he'd lit a lantern in enemy territory. In Germany, the test continued. The Luftwaffe's command praised Naxos quietly, labeling it top secret, Naktosh, Night Eye. Within weeks, every night fighter carried it. The sky became a trap, invisible and perfect. Reports reached Berlin. Detection range adequate. British bombers reveal themselves before crossing the Rhine. A general wrote in the margin, "The enemy now guides us to him." In England, Taylor finally received a decoded message from a recovered crash site. German documents describing British microwave device H2S, frequency 3 GHz, suitable for interception. He set the paper down slowly. "They've heard us," he said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nobody spoke. Finally, Taylor turned to Lovell. "Then we'll make them deaf again." He drew a circle on the blackboard, labeled it New Pulse Pattern, shorter, sharper. Underneath, he wrote 2 words, Invisible Echo. For the first time, he wasn't inventing to see. He was inventing to hide. That night, while the snow fell lightly over the English countryside, the war entered a new phase, not fought with bullets, but with frequencies. Somewhere over the North Sea, a Lancaster flew its course, unaware that its heartbeat was being heard across Europe. And in Malvern, Albert Taylor began planning to destroy his own creation before it destroyed everyone else. Summer 1943. The night sky over Europe had become a battlefield without sound. No searchlights, no flares, just invisible duels and radio waves. For weeks, British bombers had been dying faster than anyone could explain. Then the truth surfaced. The Germans could hear them. In Malvern, Taylor stood over a long table littered with reports. Missing aircraft, intercepted transmissions, the same cold pattern repeating. "They've built a detector," he said. "They're listening to our signal." The room went still. Lovell stared at the chalkboard, the frequency curve that had once been their pride. "Then we stop transmitting," someone muttered. Taylor shook his head. "If we stop seeing, we go back to blind bombing. We lose the war." He rubbed his temples. "We don't stop seeing," he said quietly. "We change how we're seen." The next morning, the lab came alive. Engineers tore into transmitters, rewiring circuits, shortening pulses, shifting wavelengths by fractions of a megacycle, just enough to slip past German ears. Taylor's handwriting covered every wall in chalk and paper. New frequency modulation, noise masking, ghost echoes. Someone called it madness. Taylor called it survival. At the same time, across the Atlantic, scientists at MIT's radiation laboratory were running their own experiments. The Americans had studied fragments of H2S and proposed a counter-design, H2X. It used shorter microwaves, higher precision, and, most importantly, a tighter beam, harder to detect. British and American teams began exchanging coded blueprints by courier plane. The race for radar invisibility had begun. Every night was an experiment. Crews flew into the dark carrying the newest versions, each one a gamble. Some came back with stories of silence on the German intercept bands. Others never returned. "We're flying through a storm we can't see," one pilot said. "Only the ghosts know who's winning." Taylor barely slept. In the lab, the hum of generators mixed with rain on tin roofs. He tested the new system personally, staring into the oscilloscope as faint returns flickered like distant fires. "Cleaner signal," Lovell said beside him. "Maybe too clean." Taylor nodded. "If we can't see it, neither can they." Meanwhile, in a bunker near Hanover, German radar officers listened and frowned. The familiar British pulse was changing, fading, breaking into fragments. "The English have altered their frequency," a technician reported. The major leaned closer to his scope. "Adjust range." But nothing sharpened. The sky was going quiet again. That same week, Bomber Command launched a mission to Hamburg using the new system. For the first time in months, the Luftwaffe failed to intercept. The British crews called it the ghost flight. On the radar displays, their traces vanished like smoke. Below them, the city burned, a sea of orange through layers of cloud. But the victory came with a cost. The firestorm that followed killed tens of thousands. The bombers returned to England, their crews shaken. One gunner said nothing for hours, then whispered, "We saw everything. But maybe we shouldn't have." In the lab, Taylor read the reports, pale with exhaustion. The mission had proven his new design worked. The Germans hadn't tracked a single plane. But the success tasted bitter. "We made them blind," Lovell said quietly. Taylor nodded. "And ourselves deaf." He looked at the silent radar screen, its green circle spinning endlessly. The war in the air was now a war of ghosts, signals chasing shadows. For every improvement, the enemy would answer. Each discovery only bought time. Later that night, Taylor walked alone outside the lab. The fields were black, the wind sharp. He could hear distant engines, training flights over the Midlands. He thought of the men in those bombers, trusting the light he'd built, unaware how fragile it was. He whispered into the dark, as if the sky might hear him. "It's not just who sees first anymore. It's who learns faster." Back in Germany, a colonel read the latest radar analysis. "The British pulse is changing," the report said. "Intermittent. Fainter." He underlined a single word in red ink, adaptive. Then he looked up and muttered, "So, it's a game of mirrors now." Both sides were right. By late 1943, radar had become more than a tool. It was a weapon of intelligence, deception, and survival. Invisible beams crossed the night, colliding in silence. Every blip on a screen meant a human heartbeat. Every pulse could save or betray. And as Taylor drew the final plans for H2X, one thought haunted him. The better he made the machine, the closer it brought them all to catastrophe. He shut off the lab lights and left the room in darkness, except for the faint, endless glow of the radar tube. It looked almost alive, like an eye that refused to close. December 1943. Snow fell over Lincolnshire like dust from another world. The runways glowed faintly in the blackout lamps as the crews of No. 617 Squadron climbed into their Lancasters. The air was so cold it cracked in their lungs. Inside each bomber, the new H-2S Mk-3 radar hummed to life, a low, living sound. On the circular screen, a single pale glow pulsed softly, like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen. "Target is the capital," the briefing officer had said earlier that evening. No one needed clarification. Berlin, the black heart of the Reich, the city that had once seemed unreachable. Now, at 18,000 feet, it appeared on the radar as a shimmering oval of light. "Is that it?" the pilot asked. "That's it," the navigator replied. "That's Berlin." They'd expected confusion, cloud, flak, darkness. But the radar made the city bloom from the night. The snaking curve of the Spree River, the bright clusters of train yards, the square blocks of factories. "My God," someone whispered. "It's like daylight." In the command center in High Wycombe, Taylor listened through his headphones as calm British voices crossed the airwaves. "Bombs away. Coordinates verified. Visual confirmation. Good hits." The operators around him exhaled. Years of failure, of missed cities and wasted fuel, had led to this. Precision in the dark. A weapon that could see. But as the reports arrived the next morning, the triumph began to curdle. Intelligence confirmed massive damage to industrial sectors, and entire residential districts reduced to ash. The estimates were staggering, thousands dead. In Malvern, the celebration never came. Taylor stood by the lab window, staring at the gray winter sky. A young technician placed a report on his desk. "Sir, they said your radar made it possible." Taylor didn't look up. "Possible," he repeated quietly. "Yes, and unavoidable." Down in the lab, the men gathered around the radio. A BBC correspondent described the raid as a devastating success. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, barely 20, finally said, "We made a weapon that sees too well." No one answered. That night, the surviving air crews returned. Frost clung to their uniforms. One pilot stepped off his bomber, eyes hollow. "We could see everything," he said. "The rivers, the roads, the fires. We saw it all." He paused, voice barely audible. "Maybe we weren't meant to." In Germany, The fire still burned. A Berlin air defense officer wrote in his log, "They found us through the clouds." Nothing could hide. The city was visible to the enemy as if under glass. Back in England, Bomber Command declared the mission a turning point. The Prime Minister himself sent a message of congratulations. But in Malvern, Taylor refused to attend the reception. He stayed in the lab, alone, tracing the radar waveforms on a sheet of paper. Each pulse felt like a heartbeat, each echo a memory. Lovell entered quietly. "You should be proud," he said. "You've given us vision." Taylor's eyes stayed fixed on the page. "And taken away sleep," he answered. He thought of the German radar operators he'd once imagined, the ones who had hunted his bombers using the signal he'd built. He wondered if they, too, had stared into their screens and felt the same cold weight behind every light. The war had changed. No one fought blind anymore. But what was gained in sight seemed lost in humanity. Taylor wrote in his notebook that evening, "Each signal I send guides not only to victory, but to a grave." Weeks later, the raids continued. The crews called them the Battle of Berlin, though to many it felt less like a battle and more like a ritual of endurance. Night after night, the same path through darkness, the same glowing city beneath. Each sortie left fewer men returning. The radar worked flawlessly. That was the problem. It revealed everything, even the truth of what they were doing. On Christmas Eve, Taylor stayed late in the lab. The corridors were empty, the air heavy with the faint metallic smell of heated circuits. He stood by the radar console, the same screen that had guided the bombers to Berlin. The phosphor trace pulsed gently, rhythmic, calm. He reached out and touched the glass. "You see so much," he whispered. "Too much." Then, without thinking, he flipped the power switch. The hum faded. The screen went black. Outside, snow began to fall again. Silent, endless, covering both the living and the dead. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, bombers still crossed the night sky, their radar eyes glowing, each pulse echoing through the dark. And in Malvern, Albert Taylor sat in the darkened lab, unable to shake the thought that his invention had not only changed the war, it had changed what it meant to see it all. Spring 1944 began with a sentence on thin paper. In Bletchley Park, a clerk unfolded a decoded Luftwaffe message and read it twice before handing it to her supervisor. "The enemy sees our aircraft and cities even in fog." The note moved up the chain, quiet astonishment stamped into routine. In Malvern, Taylor read the copy in the doorway, lips pressed thin. It wasn't triumph. It was confirmation. The dark had been reordered. By then H-2S sets were everywhere, bolted into the noses of Lancasters, tucked into the slim frames of Mosquitoes. Crews treated the green screen like another crewman. "Wake him up," a pilot would say before takeoff, and the bomb aimer's hand would find the switch by muscle memory. Over the Ruhr, rivers unfurled in ghostly silver, rail yards glittered like frost. The Pathfinders, those sharp-eyed crews dropping flares for the main force, used the radar to stitch their markers along factory roofs and bridges with a precision no prayer could buy. One night, in April, a mosquito skimmed cloud at 20,000 feet toward a bridge on the Seine. The navigator hunched over the display, turning gain and focus, teasing form out of noise. The water lay dark, a quiet ribbon. The town on its banks threw a softer glow, streets smudged into a single breath. "There," he murmured, tracing the span with a gloved finger. The pilot held course. 2 bombs fell, tight as a heartbeat. The screen flared, blanked, returned. "Span severed," the navigator said, voice flat from too many nights like this. On the ground, a French farmer woke to a sound like the world cracking, then the long hush of a river relearning how to flow. Behind the missions, the debates sharpened. In crew huts, men argued low. Was a cleaner strike a kinder one? In the lab, engineers traded looks over teacups that never emptied. A young technician said, "This is the best of a bad job." An older fitter said nothing. He had begun crossing himself before powering the set. Taylor wrote in his notebook, ink cutting into the paper, "We gave eyes to those who look into night. Must we also learn to look with them?" Then came the planning that swallowed everything. Overlord. Radar moved from miracle to infrastructure. H-2S guided bombers to pre-dawn targets, coastal batteries, marshalling yards, road junctions feeding Normandy. Navigators, heads bent to green, shepherded streams of aircraft to invisible points over a black sea. Mosquitoes marked with flares through cloud, their aim refined by a signal that didn't care about weather or lies. In parallel, another secret slid into the sky. Strips of foil fluttered from hatches and turned German screens to snowfall. Window, they called it. The night became a palimpsest, truth drawn by H2S, confusion scribbled by chaff. On a damp evening in May, Taylor briefed a room of American officers on the British sets, then listened as an MIT man described H2X, shorter wavelength, tighter beam, a whisper where H2S was a murmur. They spoke in abbreviations and sketched in the margins like boys building boats. Every improvement tasted of relief and ash. Afterward, in the corridor, a RAF squadron leader stopped Taylor. "Your boxes will get my lads there," he said softly, "and mine will get them back." He didn't add if. He didn't need to. The raids that spring felt different. Bridges fell with a surgeon's certainty. Rail lines buckled in patterns that planners had rehearsed with pins and string. And yet, precision cut both ways. After a strike near Cologne, a pilot returned white-faced, whispering to no one in particular, "We saw the river take them." In Malvern, a technician set his pencil down and said to the floor, "We built a machine that sees too well." No one corrected him. Bletchley sent more intercepts. German controllers complained that even low cloud no longer saved them. Night fighters found themselves flying toward ghosts while the real enemy passed. A curtain of foil where a city should be, a city where only rain remained. The war had shifted axis. Sight had become a weapon, blindness, a tactic. Taylor began to avoid celebrations. He left receptions early, skipped photographs, walked the perimeter roads after midnight until his shoes were damp through. In the lab, he sat alone with the hum. The green circle spun and spun, the trace brightening whenever metal acknowledged it. He thought of the first river they had seen, the way everyone had held their breath. He thought of Berlin's glow surfacing from cloud like a confession. He thought of a farmer's bridge, severed without witness but his own. On June's first nights, England held its breath. Airfields brimmed. Maps and models of beaches crowded tables. Crews memorized French names by how they felt in the mouth. The weathermen argued with themselves. The sea read its own tides. In a room with no windows, Taylor briefed one more batch of navigators. Coastlines on a chalkboard, echoes on paper. When the questions ended, no one moved to leave. Finally, someone asked, "Will it be enough?" Taylor said, "It will be enough to find the shore." He didn't say what waited there. The evening before the jump-off, Malvern's corridors were empty. On his bench, between a mug ring and a burn mark from a soldering iron, lay a single sheet of paper. A frequency plan, hand-annotated, edges curled from handling. Taylor turned it over and wrote, "A light is not a decision." He underlined it once. Past midnight, he wheeled the lab's test transmitter into the darkened room and powered the set. The trace brightened, obedient as ever. Somewhere overhead, through cloud and blackout, rehearsal flights droned. Somewhere south, ships assembled into threads. He listened to the tone, a sound he could hear, now even in silence. He let it run, counted, imagined the pulse crossing the water and back, the way a hand comes back from a door you're not sure you want to knock. Then he reached forward, and, for the first time when history depended on the hum, he turned the signal off. The screen dissolved to gray. The room exhaled. Outside, a wind moved the hedges and nothing else. He sat with the quiet until it had a shape. In the morning, the sets would sing again, and men would ride their echoes toward a coastline traced in green. But for one breath between calculation and consequence, the night held only itself. The phone rang in the hall, distant and urgent. Orders were moving. Engines were warming. The sky waited. Taylor stood, hand on the switch, listening to the last pure silence he would ever trust. May 1945. The war ended not with thunder, but with stillness. In the hills of Malvern, the laboratory stood hollow and echoing, its long tables covered with cloth and dust. Albert Taylor paused beside the first H2S unit ever built. The machine that once hummed with life now sat open and silent, its glass tubes cold. A young officer entered, holding a folder stamped demobilization. "Congratulations, sir," he said. "You helped win the war." Taylor gave a brief nod, but didn't take the papers. His gaze stayed on the dismantled radar. "They're calling it the weapon that ended the dark," the officer added. Taylor smiled faintly. "It didn't end the dark," he said. "It just showed us how deep it was." Outside, spring sunlight spilled over the hills. The same skies once filled with bombers now carried only birds. Peace had come, but peace sounded strange. Too clean, too empty. Letters arrived from pilots who had flown with H-2S. One wrote, "Without it, I'd never have made it home." Another confessed, "Sometimes I wish we hadn't seen so much." Taylor kept them all in a box labeled Voices. Each line carried the same uneasy truth. They had survived because of a machine that turned blindness into clarity and clarity into guilt. The ministry gave new orders: convert the radar for civil use, navigation for airliners, storm tracking, shipping. The same frequencies that had guided bombs would now guide travelers safely across oceans. Taylor welcomed the thought, though the irony stung. One morning, a technician rolled in an old H-2S set for storage. The brass plate gleamed under the light. H-2SMK. 1942. Taylor asked to be left alone. When the door shut, he crouched beside it, listening for a hum that no longer existed. He thought of the nights over Berlin, the green screen glowing, rivers glistening like veins of light, the crews whispering coordinates through static. All that precision, all that power, built from signals born here, in this quiet room. At an RAF airfield later that month, Taylor attended a small ceremony. Dozens of airmen stood in uneven ranks beside a single battered Lancaster. Its radar dome was cracked, the black paint scarred. When the speeches ended, Taylor walked to it and rested his hand on the fuselage. The metal was warm under the sun. A reporter nearby asked, "What did your invention mean for the war?" Taylor looked up at the sky, a perfect blue without contrails. "It meant we could see through darkness," he said. After a pause, he added, "Now we must learn to see what that cost." The journalist frowned, unsure what he meant, and wrote something simpler. Back at Malvern, the lab was being cleared. Crates labeled property of Crown waited by the doors. Taylor unscrewed a final glass tube from one of the old units. The faint sunlight turned it amber in his hand. Inside, he imagined the thousands of pulses it had once sent through night skies, tiny flashes that had found cities, bridges, and, too often, lives. He set the tube beside the brass plate and sat quietly, listening. The building no longer vibrated with generators or men's voices. Only wind. It was the first true silence in years, and for the first time, he understood it not as absence, but as relief. In the years that followed, his design became the ancestor of weather radar, navigation beacons, air traffic control. The same pulse that once guided bombers now guided people safely through storms. Pilots said its sound reminded them of a heartbeat. Taylor never patented his work. His name faded into reports and footnotes. Yet those who knew him said that sometimes, on clear nights near Malvern, he would pause outside, look at the stars, and almost expect to see a faint green sweep move across the sky. One last echo from a machine that had learned to see in darkness. And perhaps, in that unseen trace, his final thought endured. Technology can show the way, but only people decide where it leads.